Hi everyone and welcome to another lesson from Korean Studio. My name is Kim Gi-hwan. Now, before we start today's lesson, I wanted to let you know that we are having a sale at our website. If you go to our website, you can get 20% off all our courses, including Total Access Membership, which will give you access to all our courses. And to take advantage of this offer, use promo code SPRING21 when you're checking out. Okay, so back to today's lesson. Now, in this lesson, we're going to learn how to conjugate Korean verbs into present tense. And to conjugate Korean verbs into present tense, we simply add the suffixes ayo or oyo to the verb's infinitive form. And learning these conjugation patterns will be really useful because you can basically apply the same rule when you're learning other verb suffixes that begin with a or o. For example, we have 아서, 어서, which are used to mean and or so. There's also 아야 되다 and 어야 되다, which means have to. And there's also 아보다 and 어보다, which we use to talk about trying new things. But there are also many other suffixes that begin with a or o. So learning how to add ayo or oyo to a verb's infinitive form to change that verb into present tense is really important. Now, we're going to learn all the different ways of adding ayo and oyo to a verb's infinitive form, and we're also going to cover all the different irregular patterns of changing verbs into present tense. Let's begin with ayo. Now, we add ayo to a verb's infinitive form when the verb stem ends in the vowels o or a. And there are three key patterns to learn. Let's consider the verbs 앉다, to sit, 오다, to come, and 만나다, to meet. Now, all Korean verbs' infinitive forms end in ta, and the rest is the verb stem. And if we look at the verb stem of these three verbs, the final syllable in the verb stem uses the vowels o or a. And when the verb stem ends in vowels o or a, we add ayo. However, depending on which vowels the verb stem ends in and whether the syllable ends in 받침 or not, there are certain differences. First, if a verb stem ends in the vowel a with a 받침, we add ayo. So 앉다 becomes 앉아요. And to give you another example, the descriptive verb 작다 means to be small, and this changes to 작아요. Now, these are the polite forms of these verbs, and to make them into casual forms, we can just remove 요 at the end. So, 앉아 and 작아 are the casual forms. Second, if the verb stem ends in the vowel o with no 받침, we add 아요. And this vowel a is added to the final syllable in the verb stem. So, 오다 becomes 와요, and the casual form is 와. And to give you another example, the verb 보다, which means to see, changes to 봐요, and 봐 is the casual form. However, do note that with the verb 보다, sometimes we add 아요 and say 보아요. And 보아요 is sometimes used in formal writing and also in works of literature. In everyday conversation, use of 보아요 is quite rare. Okay, so the last pattern is when the verb stem ends in the vowel a with no 받침. In this case, as the verb stem ends in the vowel a, we simply add 요 to make the verb into its polite form. So for this verb 만나다, the verb stem has two syllables, so we focus on the final syllable, and it ends in 나. So to make it into polite form, we just add 요, and it becomes 만나요. The casual form is 만나. To give you another example, the verb 가다 means to go, and its polite form is 가요, and its casual form is 가. And that's how we add 아요 to make verbs into present forms. The verb stem must end in the vowels o or a, and depending on the vowel it ends in and whether the verb stem ends in 받침 or not, there were three key patterns to adding 아요. Okay, so let's now take a look at how we add oyo to verb stems. And we basically add oyo to verb stems when the verb stem ends in vowels other than o or a. And there are four main patterns. First, if the verb stem ends in vowels other than o or a with 받침, we simply add oyo. So the verb 먹다, meaning to eat, becomes 먹어요. and the verb 만들다, meaning to make, becomes 만들어요. And as with 아요, to make these verbs into casual forms, we simply remove 요 at the end. Second, if the verb stem ends in the vowel 우 with no 받침, we add 어요. So the verb 주다, meaning to give, becomes 줘요, and the verb 배우다, to learn, becomes 배워요. Third, if the verb stem ends in 이 with no 받침, we add 어요 and form 여요. So the verb 다니다, which means to go, attend, becomes 다녀요, and the verb 마시다, meaning to drink, becomes 마셔요. Lastly, we have a range of verbs that end in vowels 에, 어, and 여 with no 받침. And for these verbs, we simply add 요 at the end to make these verbs into polite forms. So 보내다, meaning to send, becomes 보내요. 서다, meaning to stand, becomes 서요. And 켜다, meaning to turn on, as in turn on the light, becomes 켜요. So these are the key patterns to remember when adding 어요. Now, before we consider irregular patterns, one other verb we should consider is the verb 하다. The verb 하다 can be used on its own, but it's also used in many other verbs by combining with nouns that relate to that action, such as 공부하다, to study, and 요리하다, to cook. And in all the verbs that use 하다, we simply change 하다 to 해요. So 공부하다 becomes 공부해요, and 요리하다 becomes 요리해요. So do keep that in mind. Okay, so far we've looked at 3 main patterns of adding 아요 to verb stems and 4 patterns of adding 어요 to verb stems. Let's now move on and take a look at irregular patterns of changing verbs into present tense. Now, there are numerous irregular patterns we need to be aware of, so let's take a look at each one carefully. First, we have verb stems that end in 비읍 받침. Now, for the verb 돕다, to help, and the descriptive verb 곱다, to be pretty, beautiful, we remove the 비읍 받침 and then add 와요. So 돕다 becomes 도와요 and 곱다 becomes 고와요. However, for all other verb stems that end in 비읍 받침, we remove the 비읍 받침 and add 워요. So 차갑다, to be cold, becomes 차가워요. 덥다, to be hot, becomes 더워요. And 굽다, to grill, to roast, becomes 구워요. Now, it's important to note that not all verbs that end in 비읍 받침 follow this pattern. And there are verbs that end in 비읍 받침 that follow the regular patterns that we learned earlier. For example, 잡다, to grab, changes to 잡아요. And 입다, to wear, changes to 입어요. Okay, so let's look at the second irregular pattern. And this is for verbs that end in 디귿 받침. If a verb stem ends in 디귿 받침, then we remove the 디귿 받침, add 리을 받침, and then add 아요 or 어요, depending on the vowel used in the final syllable of the verb stem. If the verb stem uses the vowels o or a, then we add 아요. But if the verb stem uses vowels other than o or a, then we add 어요. So the verb 깨닫다, to realize, changes to 깨달아요. And this is the only verb where 아요 is added. On the other hand, 듣다, to listen, changes to 들어요, and 걷다, to walk, changes to 걸어요. There are also other verbs that end in 디귿 받침, such as 닫다, to close, and 믿다, to trust. But they follow the regular pattern of adding 아요, 어요, which we learned earlier. Okay, the third pattern is when verb stems end in 히읗 받침. And when verb stems end in 히읗 받침, we remove the 히읗 받침 and add 이요. And this can result in forming either 에요 or 예요, depending on the vowel used in the verb stem. Now, only descriptive verbs end in 히읗 받침. And these include color-related verbs like 하얗다, to be white, and 노랗다, to be yellow. And there are also certain descriptive verbs that describe how something is, such as 이렇다, to be like this, and 그렇다, to be like that. So applying this rule, 하얗다 becomes 하예요, and we use 예요 because the verb stem uses the Y glide vowel 야, and 노랗다 becomes 노래요, 이렇다 becomes 이래요, and lastly 그렇다 becomes 그래요. However, once again, not all verb stems that end in 히읗 받침 follow this pattern. And a prime example of this is 좋다, to be good, as it changes to 좋아요. Okay, so 2 more patterns to go and we're nearly there. Next pattern is when a verb stem ends in 시옷 받침. Now, there are a handful of verbs that end in 시옷 받침. And with these verbs, we remove the 받침 in the verb stem and then add either 아요 or 어요, depending on whether the verb stem ends in the vowels 오 or 아 or other vowels. So 낫다, meaning to be cured, becomes 나아요, and we add 아요 as the verb stem ends in the vowel 아. Conversely, 붓다, meaning to pour, becomes 부어요, and 젓다, to stir, becomes 져요. Okay, so the final irregular pattern is when the verb stem ends in the vowel 으 with no 받침. Now, if a verb stem ends in the vowel 으 and has only 1 syllable, then we remove the vowel 으 and add 어요. So 쓰다, meaning to use or to be sour, becomes 써요, and 끄다, to turn off, becomes 꺼요. However, if a verb stem has 2 or more syllables and the final syllable ends in the vowel 으, depending on the vowel used in the syllable before the last syllable, we add either 아요 or 어요. So if the syllable before uses the vowels 오 or 아, we add 아요. But if the syllable before uses a vowel other than 오 or 아, then we add 어요. So 아프다, to be hurt, becomes 아파요. 고프다, to be hungry, becomes 고파요. On the other hand, 예쁘다, to be pretty, becomes 예뻐요, and 기쁘다, to be glad, becomes 기뻐요. Now, there is one exception, and this is when the final syllable is 르. In general, we still follow the same rule we just went over, but we add 리을 받침 to the syllable before the last. So 다르다, to be different, becomes 달라요, and 서두르다, meaning to hurry, becomes 서둘러요. So we add 리을 받침 to the syllable before the last, and depending on the vowel used in that syllable, we remove the vowel 으 and add either 아요 or 어요 to the verb stem. Okay, so that's a lot of information to take in, I'm sure, but just to summarize what we went over, we first looked at how we add 아요 to verb stems. And the key thing to note is that if we add 아요 to a verb stem, then the verb stem must end in the vowels 오 or 아. However, if the verb stem ends in the vowels other than 오 or 아, then we add 어요. And then we looked at various irregular patterns of changing Korean verbs into present tense. Now, as mentioned before, there are also many other verb suffixes that follow the same pattern. So it is very important that you become familiar with how we add 아요 and 어요 to verb stems. And to help you along with becoming more familiar with these patterns, we have prepared a summary document with all the different patterns that we went over in today's video. So a link to that document will be in the description below. So click on it and use it as a reference and just sort of look it over every now and then so that you become more familiar with all the patterns that we went over in today's video. Okay, so that's it for today, and I look forward to seeing you soon again in another Korean lesson. Take care. Bye-bye.